If you're like most folks who still enjoy old game consoles, you probably have one of these lying around. This is a flash cartridge. You drop a bunch of game images onto an SD card, pop it in, and you can now play your game library on real hardware. Flash carts like this seem deceptively simple, but there's quite a bit going on under the hood. So today, we're going to peel back those layers and look at the design and architecture of modern flash carts. I had this memory from years ago. It was back in elementary school, probably around the 4th or 5th grade. I was talking with some of my classmates, comparing the Nintendo games that we had. And I remember being in awe at all the games my friends had, but I didn't. You see, I grew up in a lower-income family, and while I certainly had everything I needed, we just couldn't afford to fork over $40 for a new game whenever they came out. Now, these days we have a lot of these games available online and through emulators. But despite the many different emulation options available today, I still rather enjoy playing on real hardware. And this is why I use flash cartridges. These cartridges are modern recreations of old-school game cartridges, but with one huge difference. Instead of being stamped with a single game from the factory, you can load your own games and play them on the console exactly as if you'd inserted an original cartridge. And while there are certainly many people who use these to play copyrighted games, the more exciting thing about flash carts is that they open you up to the world of homebrew software. The homebrew scene is booming right now. There are lots of great new titles and remakes that people are making for classic game consoles, and many of them are better than the originals. Now, every game console is different. The design of the cartridges, how they interface with the console, how they map memory, it all varies quite a bit between systems. So flash carts can range in complexity from very simple to surprisingly complex, depending on which system they're for. To help understand how flash carts work, we're going to make one. The one I chose for this video is a flash cart for the Texas Instruments TI-99-4A. This is an open source design called the Final GROM 99. And for this project, I ordered the boards from this video sponsor, PCBWay. As you probably know, PCBWay is my preferred supplier for the circuit boards that I use in my various projects. Their boards are high quality, and their knowledgeable technicians and support staff are always helpful. Not only can they provide you with PCBs, but they can also supply you with 3D prints, CNC milled parts, enclosures fabricated out of sheet metal, and more. And PCBWay offers some great finishes that make your fabricated parts look fantastic. So if you want to make your own open source flash carts, be sure to place an order for your boards from PCBWay. Alright, before we can jump in and start looking at the architecture of the flash carts themselves, we need to go over some of the fundamentals around how game cartridges work. Every game console has a central processor or CPU. When you power the system on, the CPU immediately starts fetching instructions from a known memory address. In a cartridge-based system, that address maps directly to the cartridge connector. So the CPU literally begins executing code straight off the game cartridge. To store this code, cartridges contain read-only memory chips, or ROMs, and when you insert the cartridge, it puts that ROM chip straight onto the system's memory bus. If you turn on a game system without a cartridge in it, one of two things will happen. If the system was designed to only run off cartridges, then the CPU just reads random garbage from the electrical noise on the bus, and this results in the system halting or doing something unexpected. But if it's a cartridge-based computer, like a TI-99, it has its own ROM chip built in. So when you turn these systems on without a cartridge, they start executing the program on their internal ROM, which is often a basic programming environment. Now, the TI-99 was odd in many ways. I won't go into the details here, but its internal bus architecture is a little wonky. So TI Basic is technically not built into the system ROM. Rather, it's in something called the GROM. But at the end of the day, it's still just a read-only memory chip that contains code which ultimately gets executed by the CPU. The design of the final GROM 99 is relatively simple and illustrates some key concepts that are universal to all flash cards. First, you'll find some type of flash storage. In the case of the final GROM 99, there's an SD card slot, but most of the flash cards we see on the market these days use a micro SD card. This is where you would copy your game files, which most people refer to as ROMs because, well, these files were primarily dumps of the data in the cartridge's ROM chips. Flash storage isn't fast enough for the console to use directly, so flash cards will also have a memory chip. The game image gets loaded into this chip, and this is the memory that's presented to the console's address and data bus, making the system believe that it's the cartridge ROM. Now, it's not really a ROM chip. In the case of the final GROM 99 and some other flash cards, a static RAM chip is used instead, because it's fast and easy to interact with. But the console doesn't know that. You also need something that takes the ROM image from the flash card and copies it into the memory chip. So you'll often find a microcontroller whose job is to load the ROM image into memory after you select it. The final GROM uses an ATmega, but as you'll see shortly, pretty much any microcontroller can be used. The last thing you'll find on all flash cards is some number of logic chips, which do things such as address decoding or bank switching. One option is to include discrete 74 series logic chips, but flash cards have limited space, so cramming a bunch of these chips on the board might be challenging. Instead, most flash cards have replaced these logic chips with something that's programmable, such as a complex programmable logic device or CPLD. The final GROM 99 uses this CPLD by Xilinx. These chips are perfect for the type of glue logic that a flash card needs. You can configure a CPLD with your own custom logic circuits and collapse a lot of that external circuitry into a single small chip. Alright, now that we know what everything is, let's go ahead and assemble our flash card. Okay, here we have our final GROM 99 board, and you'll notice that most of the components are surface mount parts. We could spend the time to hand solder everything with an iron, but I'm going to take the easy route on this one. Since the bottom of the PCB doesn't have any components on it, I'm going to use my hot plate. Now, normally you'd want to use a stencil for the solder paste, but I forgot to order one, and honestly, it's a bit overkill for a single board. So I'm going to start off by placing some solder paste down on all the surface mount pads. And then I'll place down each chip while being careful to observe the correct orientation. We also have the SD card slot, and there are a few resistors and capacitors that I need to add as well. Now I'll take this over to the hot plate, and we'll set the temperature at 230 degrees Celsius and wait. There's also a few through-hole components that I'll need to solder by hand with my iron. There's an LED, a couple of buttons, and the programming header. Now, before we can use it, we need to load up the firmware onto the ATmega microcontroller. For that, I'll use my trusty USB ASP programmer. The programmer connects to my computer through USB, and then plugs into the programming header on the flash card. We can then grab the firmware from the final GROM 99 GitHub repository, and then send the hex file over to the microcontroller using AVR Dude. And we also need to run another AVRDude command to set the microcontroller's clock speed to 8 MHz. We also need to program the CPLD, but fortunately, the microcontroller has the CPLD programmer built into its firmware. All we need to do is place the PLD file onto the SD card, and when the flash cart first starts up, the MCU will program the CPLD for us automatically. To finish it off, we need an enclosure. I decided to go ahead and make my own, so I fired up Fusion 360 and modeled one after an original TI-99 cartridge. Now we can insert the cartridge into the TI-99, flip on the power switch, and you'll notice that there's a new menu item. If we select the final GROM 99 option, we now get a list of game images that we can load right up. Okay, so that's the basic anatomy of a simple flash cart. But the story doesn't end there, because some consoles demand more. Let's take a look at something slightly more sophisticated. This is the EverDrive GB-X7, and as you can guess, this is a flash cart for the Game Boy and Game Boy Color. If we open it up, you'll see that the design is similar, but there are a few differences. First, you'll notice that there are 2 memory chips on board instead of just one. We still have an SRAM chip, and that's this larger ISSI chip here, which is 128 kilobytes in size. But there's also a smaller pseudo-static RAM chip here below it. And believe it or not, this smaller chip has more memory than the larger one, 8 megabytes to be exact. You might be wondering why this 128 kilobyte chip is so much larger than the one that's 8 megabytes. Well, that's because static RAM requires a physically larger footprint. The memory cells are composed of flip-flop circuits, and each flip-flop requires multiple transistors. Pseudo-static RAM, on the other hand, is really just DRAM under the hood. Rather than using flip-flops, it uses capacitors to store each bit, which means you can pack more memory cells into a smaller footprint. The capacitors, however, need to be constantly refreshed to keep their charge, and this is one of the main challenges of using straight-up DRAM chips. But PSRAM handles the refresh internally and exposes an SRAM-like interface to the CPU, and that masks its internal complexity. The trade-off is that PSRAM is quite a bit slower than SRAM, so you wouldn't want to use it for everything. But as a ROM replacement chip, it works just fine. And that's exactly what this PSRAM chip is doing. It gets presented to the Game Boy as the cartridge ROM. Since it has a capacity of 8 megabytes, it can handle even the largest Game Boy games out there. And this larger 128 kilobyte SRAM chip just functions as a battery-backed SRAM. Some games make use of this, and some don't, but the EverDrive includes it for those that do. Going back to the flash cart, you'll notice that there are these 2 identical chips near the cartridge connector. These are both bus transceivers, and they're responsible for interfacing the cartridge with the Game Boy hardware. The Game Boy operates at 5 volts, but the chips on the EverDrive all run on 3.3 volts. So in addition to providing isolation, these bus transceivers level shift the signals to make sure everything is getting the right voltage. There's one more pretty significant difference in this EverDrive Game Boy cartridge, and that's this chip here. This is a Lattice ICE40 FPGA. It's a relatively small FPGA. You couldn't use it for emulating an entire game system, but it's definitely more powerful than the CPLD that's used in the final GROM cartridge. This is used to emulate the memory bank controllers that are found in some Game Boy cartridges. But you'll also notice that there's no microcontroller on this board, and that's because the FPGA does the work of loading the game image itself, so there's really no need for an MCU. Okay, now let's take a look at a couple of flash carts that are even more sophisticated. This one here is a Super NES flash cart called the SD2SNES. If we open it up, you can see that it contains many of the basic flash cart elements that we already talked about. Similar to the EverDrive GB, it has 2 RAM chips and also a row of bus transceivers. But interestingly enough, it also contains an ARM Cortex-M3 microcontroller. According to the schematic, the MCU is functioning in a similar manner as the microcontroller in the final GROM99. It loads the game image from the flash card, provides the JTAG interface for the FPGA, and looks to drive various bits of the flash cartridge's overall functionality. So if the microcontroller is doing all of this, then why is there a Xilinx Spartan 3 series FPGA on board? This FPGA is quite a bit bigger than the ICE40 on the Game Boy cart, but it clearly isn't acting as the MCU. Well, SNES cartridges don't just consist of ROM chips. Many of them contain coprocessors that add additional capabilities to a game beyond what the console was designed to handle. A good example of this is Yoshi's Island. This cartridge contains a Super FX chip, which is a RISC CPU that acts like a graphics accelerator. Yeah, this cartridge basically has a GPU inside of it. So if you want to play this game from a flash cart, you can't simply just put the ROM data into a PSRAM chip. You also have to emulate the Super FX chip. So the job of this Xilinx FPGA is to do just that. It performs hardware-level emulation to behave like the Super FX or any other coprocessor that a Super Nintendo might include. And this isn't unique to the Super NES or even 16-bit consoles. Some 8-bit consoles also need complex flash cards. This is the EverDrive N8 Pro, which is a flash cart for the original 8-bit Nintendo Famicom or NES. It has the same ARM Cortex-M3 MCU as the SNES flash cart and also has both SRAM and PSRAM memory. But one thing that's different is that it contains 2 separate PSRAM chips. The one labeled PRG is for the cartridge's game code, which is known as the program ROM, and the CHR chip is for the character ROM, which is where the cartridge stores its graphics. So this flash cart has 3 memory chips on board. You'll also notice that it has a Cyclone 4 FPGA. This is comparable to the Xilinx FPGA in the SNES flash cart, and that's because many 8-bit Nintendo games also included coprocessors. Most of the time they were mapper chips, but the Famicom actually added audio processors in some of their cartridges. And one other thing is this cartridge contains an additional, smaller ICE40 FPGA as well. I don't know why there are 2 FPGAs in here, but I'm guessing that maybe the Cyclone is dedicated to emulating the mappers, while the ICE40 handles the glue logic. I don't have a schematic, so I can't say for certain, but I suppose that would make sense. At first glance, the idea of replacing a ROM chip with one you can change the contents of seems simple. But as you've seen today, the way flash carts achieve this can be rather complex. When you factor in things like save states and coprocessor support, these devices become full-on computers. I hope you enjoyed this look into flash cart architecture. A big thanks goes out to PCBWay for sponsoring today's video. If you want to build a final GROM99 or any other open source flash cart, then be sure to check them out. I've left some links in this video's description. Alright, that's all I have for today, so I'll see you next time. But as always, until then, go make something cool.